You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Credit card swipe fees are a huge issue for retailers, but there's a lot more that goes on with how Visa does business, and the recent Wall Street Journal article kind of peeled back the curtain and took a look at what Visa does with swipe fees and a whole bunch of other things. To talk about that today, we have NACS General Counsel Doug Kantor. So welcome once again to our show, Doug.
Thanks for having me on again.
So thinking about this, when we talk about swipe fees, we talk about Main Street against Wall Street. And we have the Wall Street Journal, which you would think may be a little bit more friendly to banking or discussions like that, really peeling back the curtain and looking at what Visa does to eliminate or push out competition, whether it's with swipe fees or with a whole bunch of other things. So we'll talk about swipe fees in a bit, but can you kind of set up what's different about this news and what's different about this story? And by the way, the title is Visa Wanted a Vast Empire. First, it had to beat back foes. Why is this a little different than other news stories about Visa?
So this story, and the Wall Street Journal has done very strong, straight reporting in this area for many years. But this story is different because it does show what is usually hidden from all of us, and that is the way Visa has used its powerful position in the marketplace to dominate, and not in the ways that we think that are healthy for the economy. So, for example, you may have a business that dominates because it's better at delivering quality products, or that's better at delivering lower prices. And if that's what a business does and it grows, great. That's how the system is designed. But what they found is what Visa does is literally pay off competitors to say, no, don't compete with us. Instead, take a payoff and we'll all be much happier. Or they use their ability to organize all the banks and set these fees to set them at penalty levels if merchants do business with competitors of Visa, just to take one example. And so this inside look at the lengths to which Visa went is really extraordinary. And what it does is it really shines a light on the reason why last month the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Visa, but it shows the practices to be even broader and to cover not just debit cards, but credit cards. And these are things that have not been previously reported, and many of the details are pretty shocking.
In the filing, Attorney General Merrick Garland said, Visa's unlawful conduct affects not just the price of one thing, but the price of nearly everything. That's a pretty strong statement.
It's a strong statement, and it's a strong statement from a careful person. Attorney General Garland was put in that position because he's a moderate and is a lawyer's lawyer. He was a guy who Mitch McConnell wanted to be on the federal bench before we had a kerfuffle around the Supreme Court. And so for the Department of Justice to take action and sue Visa is a big deal, and a particularly bigger deal with the current leadership. But they saw just how egregious Visa's activities were and how it not only undermined competition, but held back innovation so that the U.S. payments market has fallen behind the rest of the world.
So the U.S. basically has a system with higher fees than pretty much everybody else, and less innovation and less options at the same time, which I think most people would agree is a pretty bad combination.
It is a bad combination. In fact, I was in Georgia testifying before their state legislature last week, And one of the folks on the panel asked me, hey, why do we seem to be behind? Like these chip cards were in Europe before they were here. And this is exactly why. We were 20 years late compared to Europe on chip cards. And we're already many years late behind Asia on mobile payments on our phones, which are just starting to catch on in a bigger way here. And all of that is because by controlling the banks and controlling these fees, Visa and to some extent MasterCard as well have made sure that new methods of payment that might be better for all of us don't end up on the market at all.
So let's look at some of those new payments, and I'm going to broadly define the history of money, which is maybe dangerous, but probably started out with bartering. So there's no intermediary there. They didn't figure out how to work their way in there. And then after bartering, you dealt with paper or coins. So you had currency, and then you had checks, and checks really also didn't have a fee. So really, nobody really has a toehold in on controlling things. Then you have plastic, which is the third generation, and that's the debit and credit cards. Welcome Visa. That's where they get involved. And certainly they play a huge role in what's going on behind the scenes with debit and credit fees. Taking it to the next step, which you alluded to, is the phone. And all of these methods that the phone has potentially facilitated have presented a threat to Visa, and they've looked at those one by one and said, here's how we handle this one, here's how we handle that one. Not here's how we innovate and create the best system for the customer, but here's how we innovate in destroying competition to make things really good for Visa. And first one of those is Apple Pay, which seemed like a very viable alternative to all of this. And then Apple Pay was not.
It was not, and it was designed to work with Visa and MasterCard, not against them, precisely because of the revelations the Wall Street Journal and the Department of Justice uncovered. The interesting thing, and I love that we're going back to the barter system to talk about this thing, because what folks recognized for centuries, frankly, in developing monetary systems is that you want to make the transaction costs lower and lower and lower to make it more efficient for people to buy and sell goods and services. There's a lot of difficult transaction costs in making change for a cow. It's not so easy. By the time we got to checks in the 20th century, the Federal Reserve said, hey, we're not going to have what they called at the time exchange fees on checks. Checks are actually going to clear at the exact number, dollar and cents on that check. And the reason they did that was to make it more efficient. And it did in the 20th century. This is a big part of the US economy in the 20th century taking off and doing well, is reforms like that allowed very efficient commerce, gave everyone incentives to keep their own costs as far down as they could. And that was with pieces of paper physically having to travel to the nearest Federal Reserve Bank to get processed, an expensive process compared to the electronic processes we have today. But with plastic cards, the Visas and MasterCards of the world found a way to extract money out of the transaction. And they actually made digital transactions less efficient than paper transactions. It's terrible for all of us, but a remarkable bit of business savvy for them. The problem was that has been doomed to fail because the history of currency has been to make it more and more efficient. And they've been fighting against that history. And as we find out, in very questionable ways.
So going back to barter, you range with a cow, as you used earlier. So the transaction is agreed upon. Okay, now let me get my cow. You can figure there's going to be a hold there of a couple hours. I got to get the cow. I got to go do all this other stuff, but a couple hours. So now we have electronic payments that are processed at essentially the speed of light, sound, very fast, and not light, but somehow it's longer, these holds. So the opposite is true on almost everything in terms of efficiency, and you really can't introduce something new, as we just talked about with Apple Pay, because then something will crush it. Other examples, other common things that people look at with new payments, pixels, if you will, is something like PayPal, which also was a threat until it wasn't.
That's right. Look, with both Apple and PayPal, what Visa did was find ways to get them revenue so that they wouldn't compete. With Apple, they promised them a cut of the transactions and made sure that instead of an Apple network, if you will, that could compete with Visa, they had the equivalent of slapping your credit card onto the back of your phone, and that's really what's being used. And Visa was happy with that. And because Apple was getting money, they were happy with that too. With PayPal, there were a number of threats over time before they cut a deal. PayPal really had been the first one to, on a large scale, get customers to agree to hook their bank accounts directly into the payment system. That's called an ACH transaction. It goes through the Fed's system. It's super cheap. It's super efficient. But boy, Visa did not want that to happen. So they found a way to buy off PayPal as well. And then the next one after that was Square. And they followed much the same playbook with Square and got them to agree not to compete with Visa, not to try to, in their words, disintermediate Visa and take them out of the transaction flow. They could have. Lots of companies have the technology to do that, but Visa's doing all they can to stop that from happening.
So the fourth example that was cited, and it's probably a little less known to people, is Plaid. What took place there?
So first, it helps to know what Plaid is, and it's a fantastic example of exactly this problem. Plaid is a fintech company, and what they do is they give people an electronic way to access their own bank accounts. So what most people know, or many people know, is the Venmo payment service. Many people have that app on their phones. Venmo uses Plaid to be able to let people easily access the money in their accounts and then use it in the Venmo system. You need something like a Plaid in order to make this type of system work broadly. And because it doesn't connect through the big credit card companies, it's very cheap, very fast, very efficient. What happened with Plaid was Visa executives saw what a threat this was potentially to their business. And in 2020, they tried to buy them and take them essentially off the market for anyone to use in a way that competed with Visa. At that time, President Trump and the Trump Justice Department sued to block that merger precisely because they saw just how much it would hurt competition. They were actually successful in that one. They did stop Visa from taking over Plaid. So Venmo still works, and we're getting some innovation there, but it shows just how Visa's playbook has been. They were able to acquire a bunch of other startups in the payment space before they finally got blocked on Plaid.
So I said at the outset, we're going to talk about swipe fees and how this all relates to swipe fees. But showing the playbook that goes beyond what typical retailers see and showing all these other things, whether it's consumer to consumer, Visa wants a piece of everything. It's, what is that saying? They're everywhere you want to be. Or as the article said, it's like they're everywhere they want to be, which is everywhere you want to be. What does this mean with the decades-long battle with swipe fees, particularly credit cards. Is there, because of this story and because of the heightened awareness of practices that, I'll say this politely, may not be of benefit to consumers, what's the big takeaway here?
So the takeaway first is that Visa's engaged in some bad acts. And look, the Justice Department will have to prove those, but it does show everyone who's paying attention just how far they've gone. That will certainly help our efforts on credit card swipe fees. One of the most interesting things about this, and I referenced it earlier, but to make it clear, the Department of Justice sued Visa only with respect to debit cards. Now, why is that? Well, there is an underlying law that we worked on, the Durbin Amendment, that requires some basic level of competition on debit cards. That is, 2 different network options on debit cards. And what DOJ found is Visa engaged in all these practices to undercut that part of the law and make sure there was no competition or as little as possible. That's the basis of their lawsuit. They didn't sue on credit cards. The interesting thing is the Wall Street Journal shows it's even worse on credit cards. There's nothing in terms of this type of competition on credit cards. But without that underlying legal foundation, it's tough for DOJ to act. That demonstrates very clearly why we need the Credit Card Competition Act or some piece of legislation to provide that foundational level of competition so that, one, we have that, hopefully, or two, if Visa goes to, uses these types of schemes again, there can be enforcement. So it certainly should help our efforts, and it does expose that what Visa's doing is not, as they sometimes try to claim, investing in the system and making it better. It's investing in holding the system back and making it worse, because fintech companies could be making it better if Visa didn't get in the way.
So here we've talked about we need to get our voices told. And there's been a number of fly-ins that NACS and the Merchants Payments Coalition has organized. One of the numbers I've heard bandied about is the credit card companies have spent about $100 million in running ads, whether it's during football games, demonizing anyone who is trying to affect change, policymakers. So there's this Credit Card Competition Act that has bipartisan support from both the House and the Senate, but it needs to get to a vote. And retailers don't have $100 million laying around like Visa does. What they do have is they have stories to tell, and they have connection points with elected leaders to tell their story and say, you need to do something about this. Now, we don't know how the political landscape will change, but there's always opportunities that NACS and others are looking at to move this legislation forward. And the best way to move legislation forward is to make sure legislators know it's an issue. So how can retailers, why is it important, first off, for retailers to make their voice heard, because there could be a potential opportunity here?
Yeah, the formula is really pretty simple. As you pointed out, the credit card industry has lots and lots of money to spend to try to keep things the way they are. And frankly, that $100 million or so, which includes lobbying, ads, et cetera, is cheap for them compared to the billions they were trying to spend to, say, buy up Plaid to keep competition out of the market that way. So they're pouring the money in, and as you know, we can't match that. What we do have is people who run businesses, work in businesses, and those voices are absolutely key. I will tell you, Visa has enough money. They've actually spent money putting together a fake small business group to pretend that actually small Main Street businesses don't want the Credit Card Competition Act. So our only hope, given that incredible array of resources against us, is really an army of people in the convenience industry, as well as our coalition partners. We work with restaurants and grocers and retailers of all sorts. We've even been working with folks like dentists and campgrounds and RV parks and the lumber industry. You name it, folks have literally, in this case, come out of the woodwork to oppose a Visa and MasterCard and push for competition because there's so many businesses that take credit cards and realize they're getting ripped off.
So as we wrap up, we mentioned that you never know what opportunities present themselves. So what you need to do is you need to make issues top of mind. And over the months or over the years, we've said, please do this. Your voice matters. It really does matter. How do they communicate their voice?
So there's a few things. One, you can go to NACS's website and send grassroots communications. You can contact the government relations team at NACS and work with us if you want to write an article for your local paper or write a letter or what have you. You can come to fly-ins. We will have fly-ins in November and December to bring people to meet in person. You can meet with your member of Congress back home. You don't have to come to Washington to do that. We can help you set that up and do it as well. All of those things are tremendously important. And one thing I would emphasize, because we get this question a lot, lots of our members assume that, Congress only cares about the biggest businesses that have the most resources. And I'm not that, so it doesn't really matter. The opposite is actually true. What we have found time and time again is members of Congress care more about small businesses in their districts and states. They know how hard it is to run a small business and keep it going. So don't sell yourself short. No matter if you have one store, if you have two stores, no matter how large or small, those voices really do matter, and members of Congress care about hearing from you.
It's a great article in the Wall Street Journal because it is a terrible combination to have higher fees that are then used to tamp down innovation and have less advanced payment systems than many other countries. So the newspaper article, I think, was very illuminating to a lot of people. Let's keep the message going because we're getting some traction and we do have momentum. Thank you, Doug, for joining us again today to explain what's going on with this issue, and we look forward to talking to you more as this advances.
Thanks for having me on again. I always enjoy it.
And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.